It was an outstanding program, and congratulations to all. Then I would like them to ask questions of one another, if they would care to do so.
Let's go to audience questions.
I have a question for Griffs. So, when you started this process of, collecting the letters, what inspired you to keep doing this? Because you put in a lot of time, no money. What kept you going through all this?
Well, is this on?
No. Here, do you want to try this one?
Test? All right. Well, I was retired, and so it wasn't like I had a lot of other competing interests, but I should say that I've managed to stay married all these years since I've been doing this, and I have to commend my wife, Rosemary, for putting up with it. I mean, we do take vacations and do other things together, but most of my waking hours, if when I'm not eating or playing golf or some other thing, I do this, and I do it because I love it. Every day is a new experience for me. When it's like, getting surprise mail every day. I never know when I open up a letter who it's going to be from, and what it might say, and what it might tell us about the 19th century that maybe we didn't know, and I just enjoy it. That's what motivates me, keeps me going. So as I said, when I started, I had no idea that it would. 15 years later, I'd still be doing it, and I don't know how much longer I'll continue to do it. But as long as I enjoy it, I will. So.
Any other? Okay, from the audience for Tim Good. How do you think Lincoln would have handled lynching if he had lived longer?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm always fascinated about discussions about, if Lincoln had lived, how that would have turned out. Now, I'm going to have Kate correct anything I say here, because I've had some fascinating discussions with her as well. And one of the most important parts, when you look at Lincoln, the idea is, well, if he hadn't been assassinated, everything would have been perfect, almost a Pollyanna view of American history. And I simply don't believe that was the case. Again, he's fighting against something that has been taught for generations. And just because the 13th Amendment is adopted to the Constitution doesn't mean the next day all white America wakes up and says, well, everybody's equal. And hence the battles we continue to fight throughout the 1800s and well into the 20th century and today. And so I think there would have been some differences, but it's a very cautionary statement to suggest that you don't have the civil rights movement of the 20th century if Lincoln had lived to complete a second term. And I'd be dying to know if Kate would agree with anything I just said. So
You're on.
I totally agree with you. I mean, first, one thing that comes to mind about what would Lincoln have thought of lynching? I mean, just going back to the Lyceum address, Lincoln was a total rule of law guy. I mean, he was a lawyer and he believed in law and he was scrupulous about interpreting the Constitution. And so the notion of just mob violence going in any direction, I think Lincoln had a big problem with people who break the law instead of following what the law requires. I mean, even to the point where, right, he did not like the Fugitive Slave Act, but he said, I'm coming into the presidency, I'm going to enforce it as long as it's the law of the land. And so to the extent that lynching is part of the definition of lynching is it's extrajudicial, extra legal action, he would have hated it on those grounds, right? Just on the question of, because a lot of people have the question of, if Lincoln had lived, what would have happened? How would Reconstruction have been different? Or how would the period after the Civil War have been different? And I agree with what Tim said, and I'll just, so what Tim is basically saying is, and you said it, just because you pass these new policies doesn't mean that essentially all of these white Americans who've learned various forms of racism for their whole lives are just suddenly going to be like, okay, fine, I'll go along with it, right? So whoever was president after the Civil War faced a project of immense, monumental proportions of how to bring the country back together, and on what terms? And how do you try to protect the rights of African Americans against their neighbors who fought for them to continue to be enslaved? And so before we sort of imagine that if Lincoln had lived through his second term, you know, there would have been peace and there would have been cooperation by white Southerners, think about what those folks were invested in terms of slavery, in terms of kind of, you know, their economic fortunes depended on it, right? And so, not to mention their racial worldview, but if I could just say one more thing, I think that the fantasy about Lincoln is also a fantasy about national reconciliation that casts Reconstruction in a negative light. So part of the fantasy about Lincoln, if Lincoln had lived, everything would have been great, is also the idea that the radical Republicans who actually tried to create a multiracial democracy during Reconstruction were in the wrong. And to go back to Birth of a Nation, that is the narrative in Birth of a Nation, that it was the Thaddeus Stevenses of the world who were in the wrong, and it was the Ku Klux Klan and the sort of moderate Northerners who were in the right. So I think one of the things that we're all kind of, where many of us who work on Reconstruction are trying to do is help people understand how twisted the traditional history of Reconstruction was, and how much we actually don't understand and need to understand about Reconstruction in order to better understand the history of this country.
A point well taken. But apropos of your point about Lincoln and the Fugitive Slave Law, Lincoln does say he's a man of the law. For as long as the Fugitive Slave Law is on the books, it has to be honored, but it should be modified so that no black man could be imprisoned unless it was by the same standard that white people have. Which is really and people I think misunderstand that. That really is a call for black citizenship rights, which goes back to '54 even, and it's in the first inaugural. Now it's couched in language which seems very moderate and very sensible, but the essence of it is, if a black person is accused of being a runaway slave, that black person has the right to a trial by jury, to a lawyer, the right to appeal, all those guarantees that are in the Bill of Rights. And also, apropos of Lincoln and the immediate end of the war, what he would have done. Well, I think it's not fully appreciated that Lincoln, in his last public speech, which he didn't know was going to be his last public speech, called for limited black voting rights, at least for the soldiers who had served in the armed forces and the very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate. Now, Frederick Douglass says in a speech that has escaped the attention of most people, but the copy of it is in the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress. In December of 1865, Frederick Douglass said, well, when Lincoln gave that limited endorsement just to black suffrage, just to the men who had served in the armed forces and just to the very intelligent, I and many of my abolitionist friends, we were all very disappointed by the limited nature of that. But we were wrong. We should have recognized that Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. Having done that, then you take a big hammer, a maul, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that once Lincoln inserted the thin edge of the wedge, publicly, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And that image, by the way, also comes from Owen Lovejoy. He used the same image a little earlier in the war. So anyhow. Okay, for Tim, I remember reading in the Lincoln papers a general order that for every black soldier re-enslaved, a Confederate soldier would be sentenced to hard labor, and for every black soldier executed, a Confederate soldier or sailor should be executed. Is that not the case? And if so,
It's July 30th.
it's a formal document that was published, but it was never implemented. And also apropos of the Lyceum address, the first public speech Lincoln gave here in Springfield, Lincoln's language about lynching is very strong. You know, it's this horror-inducing case of a black man being burned alive 2 hours after he had been walking down the street all by himself as a free man. Well, not all by himself, but so you want to comment on that? Okay.
Yeah, I think the Lyceum speech is just a wonderful insight into Lincoln's thoughts, on lynching, on mob violence. And as Michael said so well, he was very strict about holding to the law in terms of these particular rights. So you can see how he abhors this type of violence for that reason. But I think it's interesting, too, if you look at Lincoln in terms of the laws, how does he react to the Underground Railroad? It's illegal. That violates federal law. How many times did Lincoln talk about the illegality of the Underground Railroad?
And his neighbor, James
Exactly,
Jenkinson.
James Jenkinson's right.
Yeah, right.
Ignores it.
Right. And he's got a neighbor, a black neighbor,
Right.
who's active.
And we know for a fact, 2 doors down from him, or 3 doors down from him, he's got an African American who was caught with a freedom seeker heading up to Bloomington, Illinois.
Right.
But Lincoln doesn't say, and so you can see the contrast with Lincoln's heart is,
Right.
or his mind is, on this issue, and he's just going to ignore it. He can keep going. I'm not going to say anything against it.
Okay. And Kate Mazur, do you agree that U.S. Grant has seen his rating by professional historians rise due to his regard as president for civil rights?
Certainly, yeah. So there have been a number of recent books about Grant. Yeah. So Grant is being sort of resurrected, or as it were, not really. And so this actually the turn in beginning to see Grant or see Grant's presidency as characterized more by an effort to enforce the civil rights of African Americans in the South, particularly in his first term, taking on the Klan with the newly founded Justice Department, while downplaying things like corruption and scandal, right, which used to be at the forefront of the scholarship on Grant's presidency. I think it's a good move. It's it's like we want to see this in a more balanced way. But I also think, just to kind of get back to something I said a minute ago, it also reflects the reality that we, as we historians in general, and hopefully increasingly we as a country, are beginning to revisit Reconstruction and understand the oversights, right? Like if you, 50 years ago wrote a biography of Grant that paid really no attention to his policies toward the South and a lot of attention to shady business dealings and corruption, part of the reason why you would have done that is because you didn't think there was anything useful to say about Reconstruction. You thought the whole thing was a disaster. Why talk about the South? Why talk about something controversial? Why talk about something that still is unresolved, right? And now the historians who are writing about Grant in this way are taking on these issues in a way that is really important, right? It's important to illuminate that Grant, was not just a really terrific general. He was not also like his great generalship followed by a terrible presidency, right? But that there's more to be said there, and I think it's a really salutary kind of development and reflects the larger effort to try to understand Reconstruction better.
John, you want to address that too?
No, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yes, please.
I think what's fascinating, too, if you look at Grant and you look at his memoirs, so he's writing, he's dying, and he knows he's dying. And at the end, he opens up his final chapter by saying that slavery is the cause of the war. Why would he feel so compelled in 1885 to write that as one of the most important messages he's leaving with the American people? Well, the lost cause is building up steam here, and Grant sees this, that they're going to recharacterize the Civil War, and slavery is not going to be a part of it. And so in his final months, he's desperately trying to tell the American people, do not forget what caused this war. Don't let them win. But as we well know, the lost cause is going to override even Grant's memoirs and continue well in force into the 20th century.
Well, a point well taken. Right. Now, I must add a slightly dissenting note here. One of the things that made Reconstruction possible, that is, for black people to become first-class citizenships in fact as well as in law, was a Republican Party that stuck together. And Lincoln was very gifted at that. And a new book is going to be released soon called Boss Lincoln by Matthew Pinsker. And he argues that the notion that Lincoln, when he entered the presidency, was woefully ill-equipped. He only had one term in the United States House of Representatives, and therefore he was not very well equipped to deal with the challenges of the presidency. And Matt says that's nonsense. In his 20s, 30s, and 40s, he had been working almost full-time building coalitions. And political coalitions, where you get a party and then you try to expand it and then become effective and do something. And that Lincoln was well equipped to be the president thanks to this experience of party building. And that the notion that Lincoln was the tender-minded person to appeal to the better angels of our nation is true, or nature is true, but he was also a tough-minded political organizer and boss. But what Grant does is foolishly break up the Republican coalition over Santo Domingo, whether we should annex Greenland. I mean, Santo Domingo. And it was just ruinous. And the leading radical in Congress, Charles Sumner, is deposed from his chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because of his opposition to it. A leading diplomat, Motley, is fired because he had been a supporter of Sumner. This sort of petty vindictiveness and spitefulness of Grant over this Santo Domingo issue helped split the Republican Party so that in 1872 there was a major faction called the Liberal Republicans who revolted. Now Grant still won re-election, but that helped crack. The crack had been opened and it was going to widen as time went by. Okay, Griff, have you come across any documents referring to Lincoln prior to his election?
Yeah, there are a few in the book. I don't, none of them come to mind specifically. It was mostly, I think, about him entering the campaign, his name being promoted as a candidate, emerging from the crowd in Illinois as a possible candidate, I think, but not very much. Can you think of one?
Yeah, we have, is this on? We have one, let me switch. We've got one from 1858 that looks at the campaign here in Illinois, and then the majority begin in 1860 with Lincoln's nomination to the presidency. And so those early letters trace people's feelings in the lead up to the election, the aftermath of the election, and then a handful of them are people who saw Lincoln during the inaugural journey. And so we've got some accounts in there of people seeing him in Trenton, giving the speech to the state senate, in Philadelphia, speaking at Independence Hall. And so those are firsthand accounts of Lincoln before his inauguration.
Uh-huh. So another question. There are 16,000 books about Lincoln.
And Michael did half of them.
How can we judge whether they are credible or not?
It's a big question.
I wouldn't touch that.
So if it's written by any of the people up here, they're good. And one of the challenges of going to the Lincoln field is because there are so many books on it. I mean, and some people have actually confessed to me that they have an interest in Lincoln, but they don't want to write a Lincoln book because there's so much that's already been written on him. But generally, I think, you can look at the main scholars of the time and read their books. And, among the Lincoln scholars, there's going to be a general recognition. I mean, Jason Emerson's here. He's highly respected. Obviously, Michael, Kate, John. And so you can find them if you talk to the quote-unquote inner circle. You're going to find the ones that are highly respected. I think that's a good way to go if you're looking to start reading on Lincoln. I generally, Benjamin Thomas's book, which is mentioned, if you're looking for a single volume, I think it's a wonderful way to introduce someone to the Lincoln field. Obviously, David Donald's biography is highly respected, as well as Ron White's. Whenever I have someone that's interested, I usually start with those, and then maybe graduate them up to Michael's book.
No, wait a minute. One volume.
For that. So.
Pamphlet.
But I will, in all defense of Michael, it's very well written. It's also an outstanding reference book. And I know we use that constantly as a reference book. We go there. His footnotes are phenomenal, and that helps immensely. So I did give you a
Well,
compliment.
thank you. I appreciate that.
For that. But I think if you talk to Lincoln scholars, you're going to find the ones that, and there are some I would say non-academics that have done some great books on Lincoln to read as well.
Okay, for Ted, except for President Lincoln's mourning of Stephen A. Douglas, could you add another piece of evidence that the president reconciled with Mr. Douglas?
Well, I think that I was reading about they met together at the White House, and they were planning.
Yeah.
He invited him to. Douglas showed up at the White House. Lincoln was glad to see him.
Right.
Invited him to plan the Civil War, and Douglas turned out to be actually more of a hardliner than Lincoln. Lincoln wanted 75,000 men. Douglas wanted 200,000 men.
Right.
He said, "You don't understand the dishonest motives of these men as well as I do," because Douglas had been through the convention and had seen his candidacy scuttled by Southern intransigence.
Right.
So I think Lincoln respected the fact that Douglas was a Unionist, and Douglas had the same trouble with the Confederates that he was having.
Right. And I make the argument, and I'm hardly alone in this, that that one of the great tragedies for Lincoln as president was the death of Douglas.
Yeah.
That as long as Douglas was alive, he was the spokesman for the Democratic Party, and he was a responsible Unionist, and he was for the war effort 100%. And his demise then meant that replaced by.
Yeah, well, he played a role in bringing Northern Democrats into the Union behind Lincoln,
Right.
into the war effort.
And Lincoln was a coalition builder, and Douglas was going to really help make that coalition.
He was a war Democrat. He wasn't a Copperhead.
Right, right, and that the Copperheads then tended to be the ones who stepped into the void that was created by Douglas's death, which was a great shame. Okay, for Kate Mazur, what, in your opinion, oh my goodness, I'm used to reading bad handwriting, but can you read that?
What, in your judgment, prevented Lincoln from publicly opposing the black laws? Lincoln, in his opposition to the Dred Scott decision, did advocate the right of due process of law for black Americans. Why did he not publicly make the same case for the Illinois laws? Yes, great question. And, and it's a great point, by the way. I hadn't known until I worked on this book that, because this is a little bit of a tangent, but we think about the Dred Scott decision now. It's this kind of landmark in our popular memory. It represents when the Supreme Court goes wrong. The reality is the entire Republican Party thought that decision was illegitimate. Everyone in the Republican Party spoke out against the Dred Scott decision when it came out. They didn't say, oh, the Supreme Court said it, so we just can't really say anything about it. That would be too political. They all, including Lincoln, came out and said, they are acting like it's grounded in history, but Taney's got his history wrong. This decision is wrong on the facts of the case. It's wrong on the history. And that included Lincoln, and he gave a really powerful speech against the Dred Scott decision here in Springfield, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so the circulation of the Dred Scott decision when it came out, there's a lot of, Martha Jones has a really interesting chapter in her book about just outright defiance of the decision by state courts. But anyway, so then though Lincoln does not proceed to denounce the Illinois black laws, and I think that partly this is a question of Illinois politics, and whereas the Dred Scott decision is not, right? So it's easier to oppose the Dred Scott decision because it doesn't directly affect the political milieu that you're in. Plus, it's kind of a party line position that you're going to oppose it. You think it's a terrible decision. When it comes to the Illinois black laws, as Michael and I were talking about before, if Owen Lovejoy opposed the Illinois black laws publicly, and so it would characterize you within the Republican Party as kind of on the left side of the Republican Party to oppose them. And Lincoln was not on that side of the Republican Party. He didn't want to be. He didn't position himself there. And that has to do with political pragmatism, that he wanted to make sure that, as I sort of put it in my book during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he didn't want to give Stephen Douglas the latitude to be able to sort of portray Lincoln as a miscegenationist, as a person who would, wanted the most radical forms of racial equality. So Lincoln, if he had endorsed repeal, would have given his opponents more ammunition for saying that kind of thing about him, and he didn't want that because he wanted to be a mainstream politician. And if he had been on the record for repeal of the black laws, he probably could not have ended up being the Republican candidate for president. So it was a politically savvy probably for him to take that position, but also, it's just a fact that he was not on the kind of most progressive side of the Republican Party on those issues.
I would add on the Dred Scott issue that as president, he then promptly ignored it. And so in 1862, he has his attorney general declare that African Americans are citizens and can receive passports, and black Americans start getting passports. The Dred Scott decision had said black people are not citizens and cannot sue in the federal courts, and Lincoln just ignored that. On the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, said that Congress cannot prohibit slavery from extending into the territories. And was it 1864 or 62 that they passed a law, and Lincoln signed it, prohibiting slavery from expanding into the territories. So once he was in office, Lincoln was more than happy to ignore two of the main holdings of the Dred Scott decision.
And one of Lincoln's admirers, and I know somebody that Lincoln really admired, the Petroleum v. Nasby author, asked him, says, Lincoln, why are you making such a big to-do about this miscegenation clause in the Illinois black laws? And he says, that law is not, that doesn't amount to anything. I'm not going to marry a black woman, and none of my friends are. And if a black woman wants to marry a white man, let her go, as long as she can stand it. And on that note, I think we should call it. Once again, let's express our thanks to the panelists and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.